Greetings. We've been in Galilee. This is AD29. We're near the end of August, and we're starting in early September. And Jesus had already exiled devils, or drove out devils, I should say, from people in the city of Sept, which is near Nazareth, just a bit north of Nazareth. And now his ministry continues and things are amping up. So the readings are getting a lot longer, which means the episodes are going to start to, I'm not going to be doing month by month or even map by map anymore because of the length of the reading. So we're Saturday, August 27th, AD 29, and this is the 29th of Ab, the Jewish month of Ab. Jesus taught on the Sabbath of the baptism of John. He said that, although their piety was praiseworthy, yet excess was dangerous, that there are different ways to salvation, that splits in the community would easily give rise to sects, that in their pride they looked down upon their weaker brethren, who could not do so much as they themselves, but who should be succored by the stronger. Such teaching as his was very necessary here, for in the outskirts there were people who had mixed with the pagans, and who were destitute of rule or direction because the Nazarites had separated from them. Jesus visited these people in their homes and invited them to his instruction on baptism. Next day, Jesus was present at a repast given him by the Nazarites, at which circumcision was spoken of in connection with baptism. For the first time, I heard Jesus speaking of circumcision, but I cannot exactly recall his words. He said something to this effect, that the law of circumcision had a reason for its existence, which would soon be taken away, when the people of God would come forth no longer according to the flesh from the family of Abraham, but spiritually from the baptism of the Holy Spirit. Great numbers of the Nazarites became Christians, but they clung so tenaciously to Judaism that many of them, seeking to combine Christianity with it, fell into heresy. Now we're in the Jewish month of Elul, which is 29 days. We're starting August 28, 29, and this one goes to late September. So apparently this is 8 in the morning Jerusalem time. And the subtext here is Jesus among the publicans. When Jesus left Jezreel, he journeyed a while toward the east, then went around the mountain which lay between Jezreel and Nazareth, and, about 2 hours from the former place, reached a number of houses standing in rows on either side of the high road. They were occupied by publicans. Some poor Jews dwelt under tents at a little distance from the road. That road, along which the dwellings of the publicans stood, was fenced in by wickerwork, the entrance at either end being closed. Rich publicans lived here, who rented many tolls in the country and again leased the same to under collectors. Matthew was one of these latter tax collectors, but belonging to another place. Mary, the niece of Elizabeth, once dwelt here, I think. Having become a widow, she went to Nazareth and afterward to Capernaum. She was the same that was present at the Blessed Virgin's death. The commercial highroad to Egypt from Syria, Arabia, and Sidon passed through this place. Great bales of white silk and bundles like flax were brought this way on camels and asses. Also, fine woolen stuffs, both white and colored, great heavy woven strips of carpet, and lastly, spices. When the camels arrived in this district, the gates were closed and the merchants had to unpack their goods, which were carefully examined. They had to pay a tax, partly in merchandise and partly in money. The latter was mostly 3 or 4 cornered yellow, white, or red dish pieces, on which was stamped a figure, raised on one side and hollow on the other. They gave also coins different from these. I saw on those coins little towers, a virgin, also an infant on a little ship. Little bars of gold, such as were offered by the kings at the crib, I never saw again, excepting with some strangers who came to John the Baptist. The publicans were all leagued together. When one received more than his fellows, he divided with the rest. They were wealthy and lived well. Their homes are surrounded by courtyards, gardens, and walls, reminding me of those of our well-to-do peasants. They lived entirely among themselves, for others would not associate with them. They had a school of their own and a teacher. Tuesday. Jesus was well received by them, his followers also. I saw several women arrive here. I think Peter's wife was among them. One of them spoke with Jesus, and they soon went away. Perhaps they were either coming from or going to Nazareth and were executing some commission for the Mother of God. Jesus stayed first with one, then with another of the publicans, and taught in their school. He especially pointed out to them the fact that they had often extorted from travelers more toll than was just. They became very much confused and could not divine how he knew that. They were more humble than the other Jews and took his words better. Jesus urged them to receive baptism. Subtext: Jesus in Chisloth Tabor. Wednesday. Jesus left the publicans after having taught among them the whole night. Many of them desired to make him presents, but he would accept nothing. Several followed him, for they wanted to go with him to baptism. On this day he journeyed through the country by Dothaim and passed the madhouse where, on his first journey from Nazareth, he had calmed the raving and the possessed. As he was passing it, they called him by name and clamored violently to be released. Jesus commanded their custodians to free them, promising that he would answer for the consequences. They were all set at liberty. Jesus cured them all, and they followed him. Toward evening, he arrived at Chisloth, a city on Mount Tabor, inhabited mainly by Pharisees. They had heard of Jesus, but they were displeased at seeing him followed by publicans, whom they looked upon as malefactors, possessed known to be such, and a motley crowd of others. He entered their school and taught of the baptism of John. Then, addressing his followers, he exhorted them, before attaching themselves to him, to think seriously whether they would be able to persevere or not, for they must not think his path an easy one. He expounded to them also several parables on building. If a man desired to build himself a house, he should consider first whether the owner of the ground would allow him to use it for that purpose. In like manner, they that would follow him should first expiate their offenses and do penance. Again, if a man would erect a tower, he must first estimate the cost. And many other things Jesus taught that were not well received by the Pharisees. They listened only to catch him in his words. I saw them concerting together to give him an entertainment at which they hoped to ensnare him in his speech. Thursday. And we're September 1st now, Elul the 4th. They prepared a great feast in the public hall, down which stood 3 tables side by side, and right and left burned lamps. Over the middle table, at which Jesus, some of the customary disciples, and the Pharisees sat, the aperture customary in the roofs of that country stood open. The followers of Jesus were seated at the side tables. In this city there must have been an ancient custom commanding the poor, of whom there were numbers dwelling in the greatest abandonment, to be invited. For as soon as Jesus sat down at the table, he turned to the Pharisees, asking where were the poor, and whether it was not their right to take part in the feast. The Pharisees were embarrassed, and they answered that the custom had long fallen into disuse. Then Jesus commanded his disciples, Aristaria and Cocharia, the sons of Maraha, and Kaliah, the son of the widow Leah, to go gather the poor of the city and bring them to the feast. The Pharisees were highly displeased at the command, for it gave rise to such comment throughout the city. Many of the poor were already in bed and asleep. I saw the disciples rousing them. Numerous and varied were the joyous scenes I then witnessed in the huts and haunts of the poor. At last they arrived and were received and welcomed by Jesus and his disciples. The latter served them while Jesus addressed to them a very beautiful instruction. The Pharisees, though greatly irritated, had not a word to say, for Jesus was in the right, and at this the people rejoiced. Great excitement prevailed in the city. After partaking plentifully of the various good things, the poor people departed, taking with them a supply for their friends at home. Jesus had blessed the food for them, prayed for them, and exhorted them to go to John's baptism. He would not tarry longer in the city, and left that night with his followers. Many of the latter, however, discouraged partly by his exhortations, left him for their homes, while others went to prepare for John's baptism. Subtext: Jesus in the shepherd village of Kimki. Friday. Jesus journeyed through the night between 2 valleys. I saw him sometimes conversing with his followers, then again falling behind and praying on his knees to his Father, after which he again rejoined them. On the following afternoon I saw him arrive at a shepherd village whose houses lay scattered here and there. It possessed a school, but no resident priest. The people were attended by one from a distance. When Jesus arrived, the school was closed. He assembled the shepherds in an apartment of the inn and there instructed them. As the Sabbath was approaching, there came that evening several priests of the sect of the Pharisees, some of them from Nazareth. Jesus spoke of the baptism and the near advent of the Messiah. The Pharisees were very hostile toward him. They spoke of his humble origin and tried to make little of him. Jesus slept here that night. Saturday. Jesus, in his instructions on the Sabbath, expounded many parables. He called for a grain of mustard seed, and when they brought it to him, he spoke for some time of it, saying that if they had faith equal only to the grain of that seed, they would be able to transport the pear tree before them into the sea. A large pear tree laden with fruit stood nearby. The Pharisees mocked at this teaching, which they considered childish. Jesus explained at length, but I have forgotten. He also recounted the parable of the unjust steward. The people of this place and of the whole country around here were in admiration of Jesus. They related what they had heard from their fathers of the teaching and the works of the last prophets, and they compared this new teacher to them, with this exception, however, that he was much milder. The shepherd's settlement was named Kimki. The hills of Nazareth could be discerned in the distance, for they were only about 2 hours off. It was a scattered little place, a few houses only around the synagogue. Jesus took up his abode in a poor family, the mistress of which lay sick of the edema. He had compassion upon her and cured her, laying his hand upon her head and stomach. She was perfectly restored and served her guest at table. Jesus forbade her to speak of what had happened until he should have returned from the baptism. Whereupon she asked why she might not tell it everywhere. Jesus answered, "If thou wilt publish it everywhere, thou shalt become mute." And she did become mute, and remained so until his return from baptism. At this time, it may have been about 14 days until then, for at Bethulia or Jezreel he had spoken of 3 weeks. Sunday. Jesus taught 3 days in the synagogue of this place. The Pharisees were greatly incensed against him. He spoke of the coming of the Messiah, saying, "Ye are expecting him to appear surrounded by worldly glory, but he is already come, and he will make his appearance as a poor man. He will teach truth. He will get more blame than praise, for he wills justice. But separate not from him, that ye may not be lost. Be ye not like those children of Noah, who mocked him when he so laboriously built the ark that was to save them from the flood. All they that derided not went into the ark and were saved." Then turning to his disciples, he addressed them, saying, "Separate not from me like Lot from Abraham, when seeking more fertile regions, he went to Sodom and Gomorrah. And look not around after the glory of the world, which fire from heaven shall destroy, that ye may not be turned into pillars of salt. Remain with me under every trial. I will always help you," etc. The Pharisees, still more irritated, exclaimed, "What is this that he promises them, seeing that he has nothing himself?" Then turning to him, they asked, "Art thou not from Nazareth, the son of Joseph and Mary?" But Jesus answered evasively that he whose son he was would manifest it. Then they continued, "Why dost thou speak here as elsewhere of the Messiah? We have heard of thy teaching. Thinkest thou indeed that we shall imagine that thou meanest thyself?" Jesus answered, "Upon that question I have nothing to say, excepting these words. Yes, ye do think it." The excitement in the synagogue became great. The Pharisees extinguished the lights, while Jesus and his disciples, although it was night, left the place and journeyed some distance along the high road. I saw them sleeping under a tree. Subtext: Jesus in a shepherd village near Nazareth. Monday. On the following morning, I saw crowds of people on the road waiting for Jesus. They had not been with him in that last place, but had gone on ahead of him. I saw him turning aside from the road with them, and, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, coming up another shepherd field. In it were only some light huts occupied by the shepherds in grazing time. There were no women here. The shepherds went forward to meet Jesus. They must have been informed of his coming by those that had gone on before. While some of their number went to meet him, the others busied themselves killing birds and lighting a fire in order to prepare a meal. This took place in an open hall, something like an inn, the fireplace being separated from the guest room by a wall. All around the hall ran a mossy bank with a plaited support for the back overgrown by green foliage. The hosts led the Lord and his followers in, about 20 in number, equal to that of the shepherds themselves. All washed their feet, a separate basin being assigned to Jesus. He asked for more water, and after using it, commanded it not to be thrown out. When all were ready for table, Jesus questioned the shepherds, who appeared anxious about something, as to the cause of their trouble, and asked if there were not some of their number absent. In answer to his questions, they acknowledged that they were sad on account of two of their companions who were lying sick of leprosy. Fearing that it might be the unclean leprosy and dreading lest Jesus might not come to them on that account, they had taken care to conceal them. Then Jesus ordered them to be brought before him, and he sent some of the disciples after them. At last they appeared so closely enveloped from head to foot in sheets that it was with great difficulty that they could even walk, though each was supported on either side. Jesus addressed them, telling them that their leprosy had come not from within, but from an outward infection. While he spoke, I was spiritually enlightened that, not through malice, but through temptation, they had sinned. Jesus commanded them to wash in the water which he had used for his feet. They obeyed, and I saw the crust falling from them, leaving scars behind. The water was then poured into a hole in the ground and covered with earth. Jesus strictly commanded the good people to say not a word of their cure until he should have returned from the baptism. He afterward gave an instruction upon John the baptism and the coming of the Messiah. His hearers questioned him very simply as to which they should follow, himself or John, and they desired to know which was the greater. Jesus answered, "The greatest is he who serves as the least and last of all. He who for the love of God humbles himself as the least, he is the greatest." He exhorted them also to go to the baptism, spoke of the difficulties to be encountered in following him, and sent away all that had done so, excepting the 5 disciples. He appointed a meeting place in the desert not far from Jericho, I think in the region of Ophrah. Joachim had owned a pasture ground in those parts. Some of Jesus' hearers left him entirely. Some went straight to John, while others returned home to prepare for their journey to the baptism. Jesus and the 5 disciples afterward went on to Nazareth, which at most was only about a short hour's distance. They approached by the side whose gate opens to the east on the road leading to the Sea of Galilee, but they went not into the city. Nazareth had 5 gates. A little less than a quarter of an hour's distance from the city arose the mountain from whose steep summit they often hurled people, and whence at a later period they wanted to cast Jesus. At the foot of this mountain lay some huts. Jesus directed the 5 disciples to seek lodgings in them as he did himself. They were supplied with water to wash their feet, a piece of bread, and a place in which to sleep. Anne's property lay to the east of Nazareth. The shepherds had bread baked in the ashes, also a well dug in the earth, but without masonry. And I am going to end here because we're about to deal with Eliud the Essene, and that's a long section. All right, so notes. Unfortunately, these ones are a little bit long again, but I'll try to get through them fast. So first of all, the narratives, there was nothing there. That wasn't in the text. So moving on. First note, when Jesus taught the Nazarites, it reminds me of Revelation 2, the message to the first church, Ephesus, which is where St. John the Evangelist took the Blessed Virgin. He says he likes that the Nazarites are fervent, patient, that they boot out the pretenders, and it's almost like a message to the traditionalists in our times. He loves our fervency. He loves that we cling to the orthodoxy. But he tells us not to forget outsiders, that we have to be charitable and help elevate the spiritually impoverished rather than putting them down. I'll elaborate on that at the end of these notes. Second discussion with the Nazarites reminds me of St. Paul rebuking St. Peter on the circumcision in the book of Acts. Okay, the Sabbath and the circumcisions were rites that were to bring about the coming of the Messiah. And since the Messiah had come, they were no longer necessary, since the laws had been fulfilled. Now, Jesus said to Matthew, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Not to follow it, to fulfill it. When he died, he said, consummatum est. This is an acknowledgement. It is accomplished, or it is fulfilled. Next note, Jesus says to the publicans, which are the tax collectors, kind of the same as he says to the Nazarites, that they're walling themselves off. It's good to keep with your clans, but not the whole time. Jesus came down to man from heaven as an act of charity. He put himself at risk. His mother was put at risk for the sake of this charity. Publicans are diligent individuals, clean, organized. They live a good, organized life. They've mastered the virtues of diligence and temperance, but they are found wanting in charity and probably gratitude. They often believe that they themselves earned their position rather than having it been given to them. Now, if Jesus comes down to save us, we who accepted that salvation should also make efforts to be charitable and to bring that salvation to others. Otherwise, at least that message, Jesus' salvation. Otherwise, we could just, read these books to ourselves and hoard knowledge and not spend hours posting it on the internet to a small group of people. Next note, again, Jesus is keeping a low profile. Well, lower than John, anyway. He's trying to. Although his profile is elevating rapidly. He warns people he's healing and helping not to speak loudly about it because he wants everyone to partake in the baptism of John. Next note, the Pharisees were outright being lazy and elitist. But I'll get into faithlessness at the end of this session. Next note, the Pharisees saw the parable of the mustard seed as childish. Remember this when the clergy calls beliefs in miracles and acknowledgement of angels and demons childish. We hear that a lot from the current clergy. Again, it's an expression of faithlessness. I won't name names, but we all know who they are. Next note. The woman became mute because Jesus had to keep that low profile. It's important to be grateful, but it's more important to obey. Next, the Pharisees seem to evaluate everyone's value, that is, in a Forbes kind of way. Next note, recall that the good thief, the one that was saved at the crucifixion, who died with Jesus, who was at the border of Egypt in Nazareth, he was healed as a child from leprosy from his parents. His father was a bandit and his mother was just someone, I'm guessing, who was captured by them. And, well, the water used to bathe Christ was used to bathe this child, and he was healed of his leprosy. As for the shepherds in this disease, he said to them that it's a manifestation of temptation. And I've said this for a while. A lot of our physical ailments are permitted by God because in fighting them, we learn the same skill set we need to battle against the demons that tempt us. And it's the weaknesses they're using against us. God allows those things to manifest because he wants us to fight those things physically and in turn spiritually. He wants us to be without blemish so that we will be burnished until our blemishes are removed. That's the whole point of our pilgrimage on earth. We always have to have a positive attitude about it to say, I am suffering because I offer this to God. He wants to give me something, and this is what I have to give him in return. My suffering, my sacrifice. Next, the greatest is the least. Nothing will renounce this reality more than being great internally, but accepting destitution externally, in the greater understanding that heaven is the only place you want to be rich in. This especially resonates with shepherds because a lot of them are great people, but they choose to live somewhat of an impoverished life. There's not much money in sheep. Their occupation, as the result, is very rich in catechesis. Jesus is called the Good Shepherd for a reason, because he only lives on what he needs. Remember that King David's origins are those of a shepherd boy. Very rich in catechesis. Now the ultimate note. Faith, hope, and charity. I contemplated this one day, because we're given a lot of virtues, but the virtues are to be categorized. They aren't like all just to be held as plain virtues. So when you understand virtues in sets, you understand what they apply to. That is, they come in a set as they have relation to one another. The 7 deadly vices, for example, have the 7 countering virtues, the virtues of the ascension and the perfection of character. So, for example, we'll take the sin of gluttony. The opposite virtue is temperance. So instead of eating too much, you eat exactly enough. And when you practice the virtue of temperance, your character elevates. You become more holy. So faith, hope, and charity are like virtues of status. They relate to your status. How you treat those above you, how you treat those beside you, how you treat those beneath you. You have faith in those above you. You have hope in those beside you. You have charity for those who below you. Now, you are like a basin in a fountain. The faith is opening up to receive water. Charity is channeling it to the basins below you. So having faith means believing that the one above you will provide for you everything you need for your advancement, your spiritual advancement, and your spiritual nourishment. Having hope means believing that those beside you want what you want and they're trying their hardest too. Having charity means believing that you give everything that you don't need to what is beneath you so that you can help elevate them as you are being elevated by your faith in those above you. When you are faithless, you no longer receive from what's above you. You will provide it for yourself. It's independence, for example, and note how independence is so prized in our society. Faith in humanity is a sin because it means you have that lack of faith in God and in angels. It's a form of destitution. You have to have hope in humanity, but faith in God. Faith in devils is a sin because they seek for your spiritual destruction. When you are hopeless or in a state of despair, you have a dystopian view of your peers, which means you believe that if they were given the power, they would kill you and work towards your downfall. You're living in an antitrust environment. That is an attitude of despairing. Now, we have to be careful in this. We hope in our neighbor, but Jesus defines who is our neighbor with the parable of the Good Samaritan. And he points out that who is our good neighbor is he who is charitable to those in needs, i.e. the Samaritan that helped the guy that was bleeding and mugged and bleeding, and while the Levite and the priest ignored him. And he who is not our neighbor is the one who ignores those in need. So we don't just hope in everybody, but rather hope in those that likewise do charity. We have to form brethren. And this is the whole point of the Samaritan parable. He's defining true brethren from not true brethren. We have to find true brethren and spend time with them and isolate ourselves, but give charity to those that are below. Now, charity is a virtue of helping those below you, whereas the opposite is seclusion or building high walls, as the Nazarites were doing, so that you cut them off. Jesus doesn't want us to cut them off. He doesn't want us to wall ourselves away from everyone else. He wants us to extend to them a rope. Like he came down from heaven, he's extending to us a rope. We have to do the same. Now, this is a big thing in our times, with the issue of migration being one of its symptoms. But the problem is that the argument is dogged by false dichotomies, chiefly capitalism versus socialism. Now, if you argue on this dichotomy, you are wasting your time. It is worldly doctrine. They are both faithless. So too many Catholics are becoming socialists because they confuse the teachings of Christ with the teachings of socialism, which is simply not true. Socialism demands that society be faithless and be hopeless, but to have charity. Capitalism demands that society be faithless, but to have hope, but little charity. True Catholicism perfects all three of these, including faith. Why is socialism faithless? Because it seeks to abandon God for faith in humanity or an authoritarian leader, i.e. nominalism. Nominalism is faithlessness. Holding humans and relations and community as more important than religion is faithlessness. Why is socialism hopeless? Because rather than allowing people their own jurisdictional will to act charitably, it wants to dispossess them of everything and give them back only what is deemed fair. By whom? Their peers. Why is capitalism faithless? Because it is independent in nature. The whole point of capitalism is that you own land, you own the means of production, you own the product, you own the laborers, and you create isolated domains with what you own towards your own benefit without at all entertaining the benefit of the world. Now, the philosophers who are capitalists will argue that capitalism is the benefit of all, the medicine, the technology, because the people who own a lot of things tend to invest their surplus in others, which creates very rich societies that will amplify our luxuries and our entertainments and our medicine. And what they overlook is the fact that when evil people own great amounts of things, and we're in an increasingly evil world, they will take on beliefs like that the world is overpopulated, or the idea that people should not have a sovereign will, and the idea that they should buy out all of the banks and the means of production and the major entertainment and news industry and deny people the true reality, the just wages, subjecting the lesser in a society in a non-charitable way to a Plato's cave or a matrix like a universe which ensnares them. When they climb the ladder, they kick it. They do not want other people up with them. This is why capitalism is without charity, because failing to acknowledge God makes you open season for demons, vice, and evil. And they can use your talents and your resources to inspire you to vain goals, i.e. population control, that have absolutely nothing to do with God. And I say population control, I also mean traveling space. True charity is helping everyone towards virtue, not towards wealth. We want to spiritually enrich the public, not to materially enrich them. Materially enriching the public often causes spiritual destitution. And I think that when Jesus addressed the Nazarites and the Pharisees, he gave the Nazarites the warning of Revelation 2 to the church of Ephesus. Make sure you're charitable because my salvation to you is charity from heaven. And the Pharisees, well, they were materially rich, but what happened? They became spiritually destitute. That's it. Ave Maria.